All right, welcome to the Unbroken Ground, Season 2, Episode 30. This one's going to be called Fishing Lessons. I thought about calling it Teach a Man to Fish, but that seemed to be too on the nose, and so probably not going to do that. It's probably going to be called Fishing Lessons. I also could, in the weird parts of my mind, I might just call it If you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball. And that's where you get to my weird sense of humor. And if you know what that reference is, then you already know all that. So thanks for joining me. Once again, if you have any... let's talk about... if what we're going to talk about is asking questions. I've been listening to a book on questions called Questions Are the Answers. There's a couple of things I want to talk about that. And then also... just a few riffs on what that means for us as Christians, and that's it. So if you have any thoughts, replies, comments, as always, you can find me at Facebook // The Unbroken Ground. You can find me at theunbrokenground@gmail.com, as well as on Instagram, Snap, BeReal, and Threads. All ways that you can interact with me or the Unbroken Ground, and any questions or thoughts you have about the podcast. Hey, thanks for joining me, and let's jump in. So here's the thing that I think mostly sets me off as I'm thinking about this idea of teaching a man to fish. There's this old adage that's like, if you catch a fish, you feed a man for a day. If you teach a man to fish, a person, if you will, to fish, then they can feed themselves. And I think this applies really well to the idea of learning how to ask questions. One of the things that has, I guess, been a hallmark of my life is that I always have questions. I always want to know more. I always want to have I always have a curiosity about things. I always want to learn. I want to know why things are the way they are. I want to know why we do what we do, why we think what we think, why. And so I have naturally always asked a lot of questions, and I like living in the kind of in that world of, where we don't necessarily have to have all the answers to the questions. In fact, we may have questions that just lead to more questions. But one of the things that God has kind of brought to me as an opportunity is that for my work, I'm going to be teaching a workshop in November. So it's been a while. I've been thinking about this for a long time, about how to be better problem solvers. And the more you look into that, the more you look into problem solving, what you find is that more people would say that those who are better problem solvers are good at asking the right questions. And I read this, like I was listening, not reading, but listening on Spotify to this book called Questions Are the Answer. And it is just an outline of how finding the right question has catapulted people into success in business and in their lives. And it's being willing to ask the hard questions and not being dismissive of those questions that seem to go against the grain or don't fully kind of integrate in the way we've always done it before. And so like the book actually kind of goes through several different creative and business places. One of the places like Pixar talks about how they use the brutality of just exposing a person to their work, kind of a rough draft that they have, and just allowing everybody to watch it, see it, what they're doing, the direction they're going, and then ask any question they want and to give any feedback that they can. And they've talked about how hard this is as a person, as a director. You say this is your project, this is your dream. You're sitting there, and you basically just kind of open it up to, with no protection, no safeguards, just say, give it to me straight, and they just, and the feedback they give and how much better it makes the films. But it's this very difficult thing, and it's all about asking the right questions and being willing to ask the right questions. And being and not just asking the right questions also, but being willing to go and find the answers. Because a lot of times we stop with the questions. So one of the things that I think is super important, and I think that you see this in the Bible. I think you see this in just in education that's done well, is teaching people how to think and one of the big parts of that is teaching them how to question. Now, this is, I think, a difficult thing, because as Christians, we've actually, over the last, well, let's say 30 years, we've actually developed a very different mindset to questions, and we've been more okay with not asking questions. Like with the rise of the CEO pastor, the pastor's kind of in charge of the church, and he's the one that gets up and he tells you all the answers, and he tells you what to think, and he tells you what to do, and you don't have to ask questions, you just have to listen and do, and we get real comfortable with that, and we like that. That's actually consumerism in the guise of church, where we just show up and the pastor provides us with a teaching, the knowledge that we have. We just listen, we take it in, we digest it, and we don't have to ask questions about it. We just say, okay, good, well, cool, yeah, I've done my church, I've done my with time with God, I'm good, I've received, I've worshipped, and we've actually gotten almost skeptical of asking questions. And there's been a whole movement, and I'm not, hear me clearly, I am not speaking out against homeschooling kids. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that. But what I do think that there is a wrong answer if you're homeschooling kids because you don't want to expose them to ideas that you don't want to talk about or have answers to or have questions about. Like, if you're going to homeschool your kids, teach them how to question. And including teach them how to question the things that you're teaching them. Because what happens to those people when they go off into the world and they don't have the skills or the tools to be able to defend what they believe, because they've never actually broken down what they believe. They've never actually thought through the process of, why do I believe what I believe, and does that make sense, and is there a defense for that, and instead it's like, well, just always believe that. Like when people are faced with that, they get out in the world, they don't know how to interact with the rest of the world, and even more so in talking about the idea of what are we teaching youth, and how and what do we do to help youth be better followers of Jesus and more deeply dedicated to following Jesus. One of the things is we need to teach them how to think through critically what it is that Jesus believes and says and does in the New Testament, and then how does that apply to our culture now. And I talked about this a little bit, a couple of weeks ago, that we really haven't done a great job of giving youth the ability to evaluate, to be critics of their own culture, because we have shied away from them being critics of our church culture, our church ideas, because we are afraid that if they ask questions, then they would maybe walk away, especially if we don't have answers. But as a lifelong person who asks questions, I have to just kind of chime in here and really say that not having answers is less damaging than just saying you can't ask questions. Not having answers is less damaging than just saying, hey, here's kind of the scope of ideas that are out there. You go think about it. and let's talk about it, and let's think through like logically, and let's use knowledge and wisdom and things that God gives us. Those things that God gives us to be able to think rightly about things. Like He gives us that. There is an element of just faith, but that happens in everything. If you want to. If you want to be real, there's an element. So if you want to believe there's no God, there is a faith that you have to have, because there are answers you can't answer that are based in that science can't answer, that we don't have answers for, and so you just have to believe. How did we just? I mean, the constant fact that if the Earth was just 1 millimeter or even smaller than that in the wrong place, then we never would have had the atmosphere that we have. We never would have had the vegetation. We wouldn't have been a planet that we could live on. And so when you think about that, like how precise it had to be, you have to have faith to be like, yeah, it just happened. I mean, so you're gonna have to have faith. We have faith because we believe in God and in the things that God teaches us and says. So there is faith, but there is also a process by which you have to evaluate and begin to learn and own what you believe. And we stunt that process when we don't teach kids, youth, adults how to ask questions or how to think through what they believe. When we just say, just believe, don't worry about it, we remove that God-given ability for people to think through and make their own conclusions, and we even shy away from that. And I think that's what we see has really occurred with the people that are a little bit younger than me. I hate to say that because that makes me sound old, but I am old. In some ways I am, and but there are people younger than me that have gone on journeys of deconstruction because they got into their adulthood and they realized they had always just accepted things and never asked questions, and so now they're like, I gotta ask all the questions, and instead of that being seen as a beneficial part of what it means to learn how to follow Jesus, it's often seen as this very bad thing of like, how dare you ask these questions, and almost like you've got to go somewhere else. You can't be a part of us if you're going to ask these questions. And I think that is just unfortunately a overreaction by the Christian world to the shift in thought, be that you can just believe whatever you want. There doesn't have to be a logical explanation behind it. There doesn't have to. You can just, and two things can be true because I can believe one thing and you can believe the other. And that was all like, the whole postmodern relativity, all that stuff that was everyone was so afraid of when I was in high school and coming out of college and stuff like that. And we were like, oh no, we got to push back against that. And so what we did is that we pushed so hard into just fundamentalism of you just believe because we said so, that we stunt the maturity and the growth of those people who want to really ask the questions and seek them out. Like Jesus never goes, hey, don't ask me that question. Jesus knew, like he knew that the Jewish experts of the law and the Sadducees and the Pharisees were coming to him with loaded questions. Like he knew that they were trying to catch him in a logical fallacy or a blasphemy, right? And yet he never said, hey, don't ask me questions. Instead, he would be like, all right, I hear what you're saying. Let me ask you this question. What do you think about this? Not here's how you should think. He said, what do you think? When Jesus is faced, when the crowd leaves Jesus after he does his speaking about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, and John talked about that a couple of weeks ago. So shout back to that podcast. You haven't listened to it yet, but he talks about that. And So his disciples come to him, and he asks them a question. He says, who do you say I am? Are you going to leave me too? And so asking questions is not the dangerous part. Asking questions and being curious and finding out answers is actually part of how we grow in our faith, and how we begin to own our faith. When we begin to learn and we begin to see and we begin to learn why we believe what we believe and how we believe and why and how that's come about and why other people believe that way, that strengthens our faith. It grows our faith because we begin to see the foundations and the reasons why we believe. When we're told not to ask questions or to seek any of those things, but just to believe, then it puts us on a very rocky foundation, not a rocky one, but a shaky foundation, because we don't know how to evaluate beliefs. All the beliefs in the world that come there, like I say, there are tons of beliefs out there in the world, and there's a ton of situations. Like, how do we react? And so we basically have pulled ourselves back from being able to have any kind of discourse, because we don't allow people to ask questions. And when you don't ask questions, you're not curious, you can't have a discourse. And so I saw, and it just brings us to this crazy place. I think I saw someone put on LinkedIn, of all places, like, we've lost our ability to say that we agree to disagree. And I was like, I agree. I agree with that. We have lost our ability to do that. But then he went on to say, whatever this guy was, I don't even know who it was, but he was like, even if you think the other person is 100% wrong, you could still say that you agree to disagree. And I think that that's just not the way that works. In fact, in the books, Questions Are the Answers, what we've discovered is that with all of the knowledge at our fingertips that we have, we can Google everything, we can get all of this knowledge. What we've done is not become more knowledgeable, but we've actually become more convinced that we are right in whatever it is that we think. So we've lost the humility to admit that we may not have it all figured out. We've lost the ability to admit that maybe your ideas might have some merit. Or we get to a point where it's like we have to decide one way or the other. There's no, this is the only way it can be, because there are those times when you've just got to make a judgment call one way or the other. And that's when you can say, hey, look, you have some good points, some valid points, but I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer. But I don't agree necessarily with all of your points. And so I humbly say, let's agree to disagree, because I don't know. I know what I believe. I'm convinced in what I believe, but I'm not certain that you don't have some other part of the idea in such a way that I have to declare that you've got it all wrong. But we've really turned that into kind of the standard of our debate now. It's like, well, I'm just going to agree to disagree. I think that you're totally wrong. There's no merit to any of your argument. You're way off base. Which, if that's true, that there is no merit, then you should be able to reveal and show to them by appealing to things like wisdom and knowledge and facts. But if they are unable to, go there with you with the facts, you might just be like, well, maybe you don't say this out loud, but you just say, well, you may in your own sense may have to go, well, you're not dealing with facts. It's hard for us to have a discussion about a logical discussion here about things when we don't deal with facts. And that's where it gets into like the whole hard thing about postmodernism and all that kind of stuff. But in order to have civil discourse, we do have to have the ability to say, I don't actually have all the answers. I have some questions. I have a lot of questions. And things I don't understand and things I don't have answers for. And it's okay to say, I don't have answers for these things. And so if somebody says, well, what about this? And you don't know, it's okay to say, you know what? I don't have all that figured out yet. And that may not satisfy some people, but to just blindly be like, well, no, I've got it all figured out. I don't have to, in any way, have to think through any of the questions you ask me. I have all the right answers, and I think this is just highlighted for me, and this is something that has been going on for some time in Christian circles. And so and again, it's not just homeschool people. I'm not trying to pick on those people, but there are certain types of people who homeschool because they're like, I don't want my kids exposed to certain ideas, and I get that. Like I get that. Like there are certain things that's like I don't think that these eyes should see those things. However, if you're going to do that, then you need to teach them how to ask questions. You need to teach them how to test everything. That's what Paul says about the Bereans. Paul says, blessed are the Bereans, because they took what Paul said, the things that Paul said, the Paul who wrote all of the Bible, not all the Bible, sorry, who wrote much of the New Testament, they took what Paul said and they took it back to Scripture and it's like, is what Paul's saying, is this accurate? Is this true? And Paul commended them for that. And so when we don't teach our youth, when we don't teach children, when we don't teach believers to do that same kind of thing, to test everything, to question everything in the sense of like, is this actually truth? Then what we get is we get a weaker, more immature body of believers who lack the ability to engage with a thinking world. And so it's not easy, because the thing is, like, if you expose people to ideas, they might get the wrong ones, right? Like it's much easier. And so I feel like it's kind of like the way that I grew up in a very kind of loose sense of legalism. Like it's much easier to like, what does it look like to be a follower of Jesus? And so if you can do the things that check the boxes on the list of this is what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus, as long as you can check the boxes, then you're a follower. And then, I got to when I was like 21 years old, and I went to I can remember the summer camp I went to, maybe I was 20. And the guy was like, yeah, so we're walked by the Spirit. And I was like, that doesn't jive with what I've been taught. Like I've been taught, do these things. That's what it looks like to be a Christian. So if I do these things, and it was like, but then Galatians is like, you walk by the Spirit, because the Spirit lives in you. You walk by the Spirit. That's how that fruit that comes from you, that's how you will, that's how they know who you are. It's because of the fruit that comes out of you, and that fruit is of the Spirit. It should be of the Spirit. And it's much easier just to teach people to act a certain way, to do certain things, to say certain things, to be certain things, than it is to say, hey, you've got to rely on the Spirit, walk with the Spirit, and you got to think through, like, what is it that Jesus would really do and say here? What is it that Jesus, if Jesus was here in this moment, now that I'm a representation of Jesus, that I'm his representation, I am his ambassador, as Paul says, what would Jesus do? Because that's what I should do, rather than just saying, well, a Christian does this, and if those things don't fit into the box of what I'm trying to do here, then I don't know what to do, because I haven't developed the ability to ask questions and do all the things and learn all the things and engage. Then we're just going to have a more immature faith. You've taught people, you've given people the fish, you've given people the bread of life, but you've not taught people how to walk by the Spirit. And so we've created I think in some ways, not everyone and not in all places, but there is we've leaned towards creating a more immature following of Jesus. And instead of being instead of being able to engage with the world, we see that it becomes more insular. And so rather than being able to engage with people who aren't exactly like you, or who don't believe exactly like you, we begin to circle the wagons. We begin to pull in and say, well, we need our own culture. So we need our own music. We need our own schools. We need our own communities. And we keep those people who don't look like us out, because we haven't learned how to basically discern the way to live as Jesus would, in situations that aren't very well structured. This is, we go to church and we do this and we do that. And I realize that's a generalization. And so I'm not trying to be just like generalizing things. I'm just saying, like, if you're a parent, I'm begging you, teach your child how to think. Teach your child how to question. They will be better for it. Teach them that they should not just take things that an authority says, and that they should search the Bible to see what it says and why they believe what they believe. Like, that's part of the creation of faith. Like if you don't do that, then a lot of times they're just living on your faith. And then when they walk away, they get out from underneath your tutelage, your understanding, then they don't have the tools to do the things that they need to do. There is, and they can learn. God's good and God's gracious, and they can learn. But like, so much of our public discourse is so poor because it's driven by this idea that I'm right and you're wrong, and more and more we have fed into the idea that confirmation bias is the best possible thing that we could have. And so, like, we get so, I've seen it. I've seen conservatives get so wrapped up in this idea of, like, well, Facebook is only is out to get you. It's this crazy leftist place, and they're trying to sculpt the narrative. And yet at the same time, as conservatives, I watch conservative people who only listen to and never question and never doubt and never go, well, let me check that. Let me fact check that. Conservative voices, they just said, yeah, and then they cultivate them, and then they surround themselves, and it becomes like an echo chamber. And honestly, I don't hang around with as many people that are on, like, the far left, but there are people on the far left that do that too, right? They find the people that say the things they want them to say and don't challenge them, because it's hard. It's hard to have your beliefs challenged, and it's hard to have to think through, and it's easy to just not want to have to do that. Like, I had someone the other day who they're like, oh, I wish I, you always have, like, kind of deep thoughts or critical thinking skills, and I wish I could be like you. And I was like, no, you don't want to be like me. Asking questions and always having questions and not having answers is hard at times. Like, it would be easier just to be like, yeah, I just believe. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to ask the questions. I don't have to worry about it. I'm just gonna believe. Just gonna take that at face value. Just gonna move on from here. And it's easier to surround yourself with people that think just like you do, and never challenge you, and never cause you to look at life in a different way. But because I'm broken the way that I'm broken, that God has made this way, and I kid. I love the way God's made me. I know that He's made me this way specifically for reasons, for His reasons, for His glory, for His service, and so I seek out the opposite viewpoint. I want to hear what people believe and why they believe that, because I want to know that if what I believe is true, or am I, caught in that echo chamber where I'm just allowing the same people to tell me the same things, and so they're just telling me what I want to hear. And so this is not for everybody, but I seek out theologians on both sides of the aisle. I seek out, I've listened to podcasts from people that I'm like, I know I'm not going to agree with what they say. I know with everything they say, it's probably going to make me mad in a few places. But I think that's one of those important things about developing faith and developing understanding of how to move through the faith community, is that you should do that. Like you should interface and engage not just with people that you know are going to think like you and believe like you and make life easy for you, but also people that are going to challenge you, people that are going to make you question, because that's how things get better. That's how things grow. That's how things mature. And when we don't do that, we become stagnant. And I think that for me, that's the hardest thing is like I have like a real hesitation to be like, oh, I'm gonna introduce this whole thought like provoking questions on people, and it's gonna maybe wreck them in a lot of good ways. Um, because God puts that back together, right? He allows us to have our ideas to be smashed, and then God builds them, puts them back together, reconstructs them into something better, into more like who He wants us to be. But it's hard, and but that's the whole thing from the adage, right? Like it's easy to just to do it yourself and then hand them the fish. It's harder to teach them how to catch and clean for themselves, because you know how to do it. You know what to do and they don't. And we love to be in control, and we love to be the ones in charge, and we love to be the ones that are being leaned on because we're so good at things. And so it makes it hard for us to hand the reins to somebody, our child, to a youth. And on top of that, like, what if they go off in some crazy, weird direction? You know, what if they run off the reservation? What if they, like, yeah, it can happen. But if you've taught them that you love them, if you've taught them that God loves them, then they should come back. And also, like, maybe that is what you need. You need in your faith too. Is a little something that disrupts the way that you believe, the way that you understand, so that you can grow. Maybe you've been stuck in the same place for 30 years. And you feel like you've answered all the questions. And you feel like there are no more questions. And you feel like you know it all. And you're just kind of waiting for God to come back. Maybe you need that disruption in your life. Like, maybe it's not just the kids that you need to be taught to ask questions. Maybe you need to ask questions. And maybe we need to be not afraid of questions. Maybe we need to embrace them. And maybe we need to be curious about what the Bible says, and why we believe it, and why we think that's how life should be lived out, and all of these things. Maybe we need to be challenged. Maybe our faith needs to be challenged so we can grow. You know, it can be so easy to just rest on what you learned and where you're at, and yet God is dynamic, and He is constantly He's constantly not changing, but He's constantly teaching us more about who He is. And I believe firmly believe that because God is so infinite and so huge and so big, that we barely scrape the surface of who He is on this life, and we'll spend a whole eternity just learning about Him and who He is and His character and throughout all of eternity. And so God is bigger than the questions that we might have. I think that's one of the things that is so important to me to realize, is that God's not afraid of any question that you have. God's not afraid of the questions that you have, the doubts that you have, the fears that you have. He's not afraid of those things. He has answers. You might not like the answers always, but if you seek Him and you bring your questions to Him, I believe you'll find answers. Again, you won't necessarily have an answer for every single question in such a way that's like, yep, I fully know. Sometimes you go, this is my best understanding. This side of heaven, this is as far as I can understand. This is as good as I get on this subject, on this question. And that's okay. Like, we don't have to have everything figured out, every answer. Honestly, we went through such a cycle of like apologetics where like, well, you got to argue people into heaven. Like, if you just have the right argument, if you just had the right argument so that people couldn't logically deny the question about who Jesus is, then you'd win, right? And what I have found in my experience, again, just my experience, I'm not even trying to apply this to any kind of universal truth or anything, but I've not seen people be argued into a relationship with Jesus. I've seen people who are struck by his kindness, by his love, by his grace, by his forgiveness, and I've seen them drawn into a relationship with Jesus. But I rarely, or never have I ever seen somebody just argued into it. It doesn't mean that there's not good arguments or that we don't have, things that we can say. We do, and a lot of times we do. But we should not just excuse that and just be like, all right, all of that, cool, whatever. Let's not ask any more questions. Let's not try to think any more thoughts. And I think that does make us less mature and less able to interact with the world, and less ready to engage with people about who Jesus is and what that means. So there's a challenge. There's the challenge to issue to you today. If you have kids, teach them how to think and teach them how to ask questions, and force them to work on hard questions. Hard religious questions, hard spiritual questions. Like, don't shy away from the questions that they have, and even the questions you don't have answers to. And as they get able and ready, expose them to the way people in the world may think, and questions they may have, and even just thoughts that don't necessarily align with what your thoughts or what you feel like thoughts Christianity aligns with, but expose them to that and have them ask their questions about those things, because that's how they mature. That's how they mature in their belief and their faith. You can't insulate people and expect them then to be able to be salt and light in the world. You can't insulate people and expect them not to turn to judgment rather than curiosity. And so that's the challenge. There it is. Teach people curiosity and not judgment. Teach people questions and not condemnations. People don't need to hear, for the most part, people don't need to hear how bad they are. They do need to hear about how much God loves them. They do need to hear about how much God wants them to be wants to be in a relationship with them, wants to be in a community with them. They do need to learn that there are other ways to approach life than the way that they've always known. And so that's what I think following Christ, a lot of that means is that you are a light to the world, you're salt to the world, you're a light on a hill, because you show that there is a difference in how you live. And so they would want to be like, they'd want to know how is that? How are you different? Why are you different? And then how do I be like you? And I think that's what will draw people to Jesus. And engaging. That's why asking those questions is so important. So there's a challenge. Teach your children how to think, ask questions, but teach yourself. If you don't know how to ask good questions, there's lots of resources out there. Get out there, ask questions, learn how to ask them, and learn how other people will ask them so that you can be better at that as well. There you go. Thanks for listening. Hopefully we'll catch you next week.